So over to you, Don.
Okay, so thank you all for the invitation to speak about the Magic Band. Actually, it was an invitation to speak about Sporadic E, but I don't pretend to be sufficiently expert on Sporadic E to do a whole presentation on it, but I offered to talk about the Magic Band, which I have indeed written about. There's the latest version of my book on the slide there. Can I just say at the beginning, it's lovely to see you all from Warrington, from Bury, and international friends. I see Carl K9LA there, Ash 3V8SS, and others. And indeed, friends from around the UK, Mike G3WPH and others. So that's great. I'm going to talk about a bit of the history of the band, what's so special about 6 meters, explain the way the band is set up, the band plan and so on. Talk about propagation, equipment, antennas, what to expect during the 6 meter year, and how you can keep on top of what's going on. But then we'll talk about WSJT and weak signal work, because that's where it's at the moment, and a little bit about the awards and so on that you can get. So I'll press on. Here's the 6 meter DXCC standings at the moment, just to give you an idea of what can be done on the band. I'm not sure about LZ2CC. A lot of people are not sure about LZ2CC. Nobody's ever heard him on the band, and yet he apparently has 280 countries. But certainly ON4IQ is very, very active on the band. And the leading G8BCG, Peter, at 259 countries, is also very, very active on the band. And quite a few of those have been done by Moonbounce. But those of us who've been on for a long time, as I'll explain, enjoyed F2 propagation when it was around. And that's a while ago now, it has to be said, unfortunately. So let's have a look at a little bit of history. Here, from a UK perspective, I have to say, we had a 56 megahertz band, if we go back. And then VHF TV came along. And that was kind of denied to us. So, what happened? Well, let's talk about it a little bit. G6FO, Austin Forsyth, some of you will remember, in May 1947, Shortwave Mag, said to 5 meter operators, and he's talking about people who had been on that band before it was taken away, the lack of any suggestion between 29.7 and 168 megs is disastrous. A band, however narrow, would do in the 50 or 60 meg region, allocated on an international basis. And in 1956, we were given 4 meters, so 70 megs, still not available in the States, but so we were given that. But no harmonized band between 10 meters and 2 meters for 40 years. Having said that, there were some limited allocations in 1957 for the International Geophysical Year: Portugal, the Azores, Madeira, Norway, Sweden, Poland. But then in 1983, 46 permits were issued, and then 60 more in 1984 to take it up to just over the 100. And that's when 6 meters really started in the UK. And still, there were very few European countries with the band. The States had it. In fact, a lovely story, a friend of mine, GJ3YHU, who was one of the original permit holders, found himself in the middle of a big opening to the States. And some W5, who he called, said, GJ3YHU, that's not a proper call sign, go away. Because all they'd ever heard, of course, was other US call signs. But from February 86, all Class A licensees in the UK were given access with initially a limit of 100 watts ERP and a maximum antenna height of 20 meters horizontally polarized. And from June 87, Class B licensees were also given access. Before that, they'd only been on 2 meters and above. So what is the big deal about 6 meters? Well, it's a transition band. It's kind of got characteristics of HF and characteristics of VHF. And when the band is open, it's great fun. And antennas and equipment are realistic for most. The antennas are not huge. They're bigger than 2 meters, obviously, but smaller than HF Yagis. And there are some very predictable openings at times when HF isn't doing very much. And also, because most countries have now got the band, that means that manufacturers are now including it in their transceivers and indeed in linear amplifiers. One of the challenges used to be actually that valve transceivers, if you had a pair of valves in the output or a pair of valves in the output of a linear amplifier, couldn't handle 50 megs because of the internal capacitances. But with solid state rigs, it really isn't a challenge. So, I mean, the band plan very, very simply, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, you can look it up, but you've got CW at the bottom, propagation beacons, and all modes, all narrowband modes section, various centers of activity for DX calling, for SSB, and so on. But where it's all happening these days is largely up higher up the band, where you've got the JT6M frequencies, JT65, and more importantly, FT8. And indeed, actually, I showed 313 for FT8, but there's so much activity that 323 is also used these days for intercontinental working. Further up, you've got internet gateways, you've got fax, you've got RTTY, FM repeaters, and so on. But yeah, the usual thing, you know, the band is divided up between all the different activities. But again, as I say, a lot of the activity at the moment is on FT8. I'll talk more about that later, of course. So propagation, well, line of sight, obviously, it's a VHF band, but it gets interesting in the summer with Sporadic E, it gets interesting with Aurora, and you're all familiar with that, I'm sure, but where you beam north or northish and see your signals reflected back. We get trans-equatorial propagation, we get F2 propagation, if we're lucky. Well, we haven't seen any of that in the last sunspot cycle, but those of us who were around in the previous sunspot cycle certainly remember some very good F2 propagation. I work VK, I work YB, and so on, which are still workable, I have to say, but, via multi-hop Sporadic E that I'll talk about later, but much tougher. And we used to see the band open to the States, just like 10 meters would be in the good old days as well, with the States booming through. What's perhaps interesting about propagation is that very often you get a combination of modes. So for example, there was a recent QSO between an EI station, Ireland, and VP8, the Falklands. And you have to say, well, what's going on there? And we think that was a little bit of Sporadic E linking into trans-equatorial, because the TEP would not have reached this far north, but by linking in through Sporadic E, then you've got that long haul. And I've seen that happen into South America from here and so on. Just to talk a bit about, I'll start about Sporadic E. I've got more to say about it, but here's a typical Sporadic E map. And you can see that what happens is you get some intense ionization formed, in this case, somewhere over Europe. And again, I'll try and explain that. So as you can see here, because it's kind of centered on one area, those guys in the south of England are busily working into the Ukraine, where stations further north will be working down into the Baltics. So, you know, we don't all see the same paths opening up because it's a relatively short distance, you know, just across Europe, and it's a straight line straight through wherever the ionization is. Yes, you can get some backscatter and so on. And also there'll be periods where you get a lot of sporadic E scattered all over Europe, and therefore we can work all over pretty much at the same time. But you know, what this means, of course, is that you can get a situation where you can be working something and your friend just literally a few miles down the road is not hearing anything of it at all. We also, again, in the summer months can experience multi-hop sporadic E. And I show here some reports or QSOs, I guess, that took place on a particular occasion. I don't know when it was, but you can see that the blue dots, which represent the QSOs that were taking place, center around where you'd expect a hop to be. The green dots show the individual hops via the E layer. Because remember that the hops via the E layer are going to be much shorter than hops via the F layer because the E layer is that much lower. I'm sure we'd have been able to work people in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where those two green dots are, if there'd been anybody there. Of course, there wasn't. So you can see how it works and how it can be quite localized. In fact, just the other evening, there was a very, very curious opening to the States from here, when all I could work was EN17, EN18, EN19 squares. That was North Dakota up into VE4. Nothing from the East Coast and so on. And then later that evening, it just changed completely and the East Coast was booming in and there was nothing from the Midwest. So that's how it can change. So how does sporadic E actually work? So the graph at the diagram at the top shows a sporadic E cloud. You can see somewhere up the E layer sort of height and the usual reflection, F layer well above it. So there's some evidence that one phenomenon that gives rise to sporadic E is the entrance of meteors into the atmosphere. They burn up in the E region and there could be some connection. Some have suggested electrical storms that may extend high in altitude and create the necessary effects to cause ionization. Auroral activity, certainly there are occurrences of sporadic E in winter and they have been linked to auroral activity. And it's certainly the case for what's called auroral E, the result of energetic electrons entering the atmosphere from the magnetosphere. Upper atmosphere winds, one of the theories and one that holds quite a lot of force is the shear forces caused by fast moving winds in the upper atmosphere, together with obviously the summer ionization, the high ionization that you get from the sun in the summer, can give rise to intense clouds of ions, particularly in the temperate regions. And part of that is to do with atmospheric gravity waves. And what that, as I understand it, is about is that you get rising air that carries energy to higher levels. As it rises, it spreads out, it disperses across a wide area, disrupting the atmosphere up there. And this is particularly the case in mountainous areas. And very often you'll see the beginnings of sporadic E in Europe around, for example, the Alps. Which is quite convenient because they're kind of halfway between here and Southeast Europe. So we can often find that there are patches of sporadic E roughly over the top of Switzerland and that part of France. But I don't pretend to be an expert on this. And in fact, there is still a lot of dispute even among the experts as to exactly what the mechanisms are. But the main thing we need to know is that the main E season is May through August. By the name is the clue, it's sporadic, there can be rapid fading. The center of an E's cloud can move quickly or one can dissipate and another one form somewhere else. And the more intense the E's, the nearer you will be able to work. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because obviously, you know, if you've got a high angle signal and the E's are not strong enough, then your signal will just go straight through. But if there's enough ionization, they'll be bounced back. And of course, you know, when you've got the very intense E's, those are the times when you'll see 4 meters and even 2 meters exhibiting sporadic E propagation as well. So one of the other interesting phenomena that we only seem to notice in the middle of June is what has been termed short path summer solstice propagation. This is very long range. Typically from the UK, we see it into Japan. From the States, it's been observed as well. I think, again, from the east coast of the States into Japan, for example. Again, theories have been put forward by K6MIO, the article that I've shown top right, and by Hana Higasa, who's the main proponent of this, JE1BMJ, who wrote the article bottom right, which he wrote it in Japanese, incidentally, but it was translated and published in the UK and elsewhere by G3WOS. And they seem to be arguing that the possibility of these very long paths over land from here to Japan, for example, is because you get a sort of caudal hop. In other words, the signals propagate within the E layer from one ionization patch to another without actually coming back to Earth in between. So the losses are that much lower. Others would argue that no, you know, the signals do just follow the normal course of bouncing, but they'd have to have an awful lot of bounces to go 7,000 or 8,000 miles just from the low E layer. So it's a fascinating one. But again, the important thing for us is that we just need to be around and take advantage and enjoy these methods of propagation. And it has to be said that again, since the advent of FT8, which will handle lower signal strengths than the traditional modes, we've really been able to make use of this phenomenon, whatever causes it. As for TEP, what we're talking about there is ionization over the magnetic equator, which can raise the MUF over that region, but usually it doesn't extend as far north as the UK. And the magnetic equator itself is not coincident with the geographic equator, because the magnetic North Pole, of course, is not coincident with the actual North Pole. So what you're seeing here is the sort of paths that you can get, you know, either north-south or diagonally across the magnetic equator. And I can't remember his call sign, one of the PYs, PY5CC, I think, who was very high up for a long time on the 6 meter standings. He was very well located for this and for working into Europe and North America through TEP. Aurora, well, you know, what can I say about that? You get an auroral curtain, I guess you'd call it, when the aurora takes place, usually up in the northern latitudes. It can be very, looking at this, it's not going to be pretty little curves like that, but you know, it's not a homogeneous phenomenon, so you get very, very messy signals coming back from Aurora. And those of you who've heard it know exactly what I mean. Normally, it will completely garble an SSB transmission. And I'm not at all sure that you can use the WSJT modes via Aurora, but you can certainly use CW. It will sound strange, but it's perfectly readable. In terms of knowing what's going on the band, there are lots of beacons. There's sporadic E warnings by watching the MUF increase, or you can use a spectrum display, or these days, Jim G3YLA who's a weather forecaster, used to be a TV weather forecaster. He's now involved in a company called PropQuest, and he produces on the PropQuest website at this time of the year a daily ease blog. So he puts out a bulletin every morning to say what he expects to happen. Of course, he's not always right, just like when he forecasts the weather, but it gives you an idea, and it's been quite interesting to look at that over the last few days and see how it ties up with the propagation we've actually experienced. As far as auroras are concerned, they typically are on a 27-day cycle, because that's how long it takes for the same bit of the sun to come round again. Obviously, you know, we've got a number of sources of real-time information: the cluster, the reverse beacon network, PSK reporter, the OM4KST chat room, and so on. You know, there's plenty of sources of information these days, and of course, with an SDR radio, you can also watch the whole spectrum and watch the MUF increasing quite possibly. So let's actually talk a little bit about equipment. It depends on what you want to do. You can do an awful lot with 100 watts and a small Yagi or even a dipole. And the dipole on the right, I think, was G6 TGOs. For sporadic E around Europe, where the signal strengths can be very high, that's perfectly adequate. I've put in here transceiver or transverter, but frankly, a transceiver these days is as good as anything. Typically, we would have used a transverter in the past, but probably not nowadays, because, as I said earlier, most rigs include 50 megs as standard. Of course, the sky is the limit as far as equipment is concerned. If you want to do the really long haul, the really weak signal stuff, then you're going to want a linear amplifier, you're going to want a big Yagi. And if you want to work via the moon, well, that's a whole different ball game again. Equipment's been around for a long time. This was equipment that was sold in the States in the early days of 6 meters, but of course we didn't see it in the UK for the simple reason that we didn't have the band. But if you do want to be a big gun, then a high-grade transceiver or transverter with multi-mode capability, a long linear amplifier, a long boom Yagi, or even a stack of Yagis. Stacks are very effective, but if you've got antennas up for the HF bands and 2 meters and so on, then it's going to be a challenge. Low loss coax, I've just invested in a whole lot of EcoFlex 10. Because my 6 meter Yagi this year is quite a long way from the house. And I think one of the problems I had last year was that my coax was too lossy. Maybe a masthead preamp to improve the received signals, but of course you then have the challenge of switching it out when you're transmitting. And of course it's ideal if you live on the coast, but that doesn't always feature in our choice of QTH, unfortunately. So there's a stack on the left. That's a typical stack with a couple of long Yagis. On the right, you see a typical moon bounce installation. I say typical, probably typical for the States. I can only think of one UK amateur who's got anything comparable with that. And that's Peter G8BCG, who I mentioned earlier. As far as the 6 meter year is concerned, May to July is the main sporadic E season, and I mentioned the possible JA openings via SSSP in June. When we have F2 propagation, then the spring and autumn equinox are ideal, but we need enough sunspots. So we have to keep our fingers crossed for the next cycle, the cycle we just embarked on. And if you look at the forecasts, they vary from, oh, we're entering another Maunder minimum, to, oh, it could be a good one. Only time will tell. At other times, there is a possibility of ease, that you get winter ease, and there are daily opportunities to work DX via meteor scatter, You don't have to wait for the big meteor showers these days. You can work daily via meteor scatter, but the distances are not huge, but probably up to 1,000 miles or so, or indeed via the moon. But there is a new mode in WSJT called Q65. It's only arrived very recently, but that's supposed to cope with day-to-day propagation when the band is flat, and it'll be interesting to see what people can work with that. As far as Aurora is concerned, early evenings and around midnight local, but not at specific times of the year. It can happen pretty much any time. I just thought I'd show you a few of my cards. These date from when we had F2 propagation, believe it or not. Yes, so VK, YB, VR2, V5. But as I said, some of these paths are possible via these long-haul multi-hop sporadic E propagation. So don't give up hope, don't become disillusioned or feel that you have to wait for the sunspots to come back. And indeed, I started back on 6 meters on the 7th of May this year, and we're what now, the 25th? And so far on FT8, I've worked 80 countries, not so many on CW or SSB, but 80 on FT8 as of today, with 980 FT8 QSOs, including 90 in North America. And that's before the season really gets underway in June and July. And for that, I'm using a 7610, an expert linear, and a 6-element Opdes Yagi from Innov Antennas at no more than 25 feet. You can see it in the photograph there, and the WSJT software. I say that because there are other software that will run WSJT modes. So you don't need a lot. I am fortunate these days that I'm only 12 miles from the sea, and I think that certainly helps in that direction. Expeditions and contests are obviously good opportunities to work new countries and squares. They're often scheduled for the peak East season, and a decent 6-meter expedition, and I emphasize that, an expedition geared up for 6 meters will look for a good seawater takeoff, plenty of gain, a quiet location. As an example, here's PJ7M some years ago by K2ZD and K4BI. You can see they put up a pretty decent station right on the, looking out over the sea. And the problem on a lot of these islands is that the locals live in the town. They have a high noise level. The town is probably down in a sheltered cove somewhere and does not have a good takeoff. Whereas somebody going on an expedition can select a site purely for radio, no worries about having to go out to work or anything like that. And, they can then focus on the job in hand. Of course, what we're seeing more and more is multi-band expeditions, including 6 meters, but they will probably have to think in terms of EME on 6 meters. Then you get somebody like W7GJ who goes out specifically for 6-meter EME expeditions. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, they're only going to work people who are equipped to do that, and there are not that many around. EME on 2 meters, 70 SEMS, 23 SEMS is relatively straightforward to do. On 6 meters, it's a big task. The bottom picture, by the way, on the left is 3B9C. There's me on the ground there with a mallet or something. We were putting up a stack for 6 meters. From our Indian Ocean expeditions, which were multi-band expeditions, we had a lot of success into Southern Europe on 6 meters. But for Northern Europe, we tended to not get anywhere. That's why we tried EME with this stack, although it wasn't very successful. We only made a handful of QSOs. Sources of information, I've mentioned some of them. The UK 6 Meter Group produces a very good magazine and has an excellent website which brings together a number of the sources of cluster and expedition information and so on. Daily DX, of course, for news of DXpeditions, and the websites of key 6 Meter operators, W7GJ for EME, for example. And obviously, there are a lot of software aids around now, DX Alert and others, which will set off an alarm on your phone or whatever when a new one pops up, and then you can go rushing to the shack and work it, all being well. It has to be said, in years gone by, certainly, that the people with the highest scores on 6 meters were the ones who worked from home or were retired, because very often the openings could be very short, and if you weren't around at the time, tough. Now, obviously, DX Summit is a useful source of information, carrying spots. Here's the UK 6 Meter Group website. You've got spots there. You've got the OM4KST chat. You've got scores of some of the leading stations and so on. Here is the OM4KST chat. And what you're seeing there, there's a chat on the left. You see it got spots in the middle there. You've got a map showing where the propagation is at this time. The only thing one would say about this is that it's absolutely not the thing to do to complete your QSO via the internet. In other words, sending a message to somebody saying, "Oh, did you receive me?" No, you don't do that, obviously. Though I think a little bit of it does go on at times, but it's definitely to be frowned on. Yeah, it's fine if you're testing something, but if you're trying to work some rare DX, then you need to do it under your own steam and over the air, obviously. So let's begin to talk about weak signal working, what to do when there are no E's or F2, or indeed when there are E's and F2. But so we've talked about meteor scatter, which is available pretty much the year round, as is moon bounce, although again, it's not straightforward. There's a lot to it because the moon can be in a better situation sometimes than in others. You get some skewing of signals via the moon. I'm not going to go into this. Before we went to our Christmas Island expedition, Mike G3WPH and I spent a day with Chris G3WOS to understand moon bounce on 6 meters, and believe me, there's quite a lot to it. But it is a way of working countries that you wouldn't otherwise be able to work. And certainly the leaders on the DXCC challenge have got there by working as much as they can terrestrially, but by getting the edge by working on EME. And so WSJT came along a few years ago, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. It offers JT65, it offers MSK144 for meteor scatter, JT65 for moon bounce, and I mentioned the new Q65 mode for terrestrial. But even when there's E's or F2, in addition to CW and SSB, more and more you've got FT8 and FT4. It's been around. FT8's been around for a few years. FT4, which is it's a faster but less sensitive version, came more recently, but both of them are heavily used. WSJT was developed by Joe Taylor, and here we see a screenshot of an EME QSO via WSJT between ZR1L and W7GJ. I mentioned JT6M on this slide, which was the original meteor scatter mode, but MSK144 designed initially for the name is a clue for 144 megahertz meteor scatter has become the norm. JT65 was widely used in 2017 for terrestrial QSOs during the 6 meter season, but FT8 has definitely replaced it now. And FT8 was originally developed for 6 meters, believe it or not. I say believe it or not because it's being used now for every band, which is not necessarily what Joe Taylor envisaged originally. So as I say, we use FT8, we use FT4, we use MSK144. And why do we use it? Well, the figures at the bottom explain that FT8 will work minus 21 dBs below noise, SSB 10 dBs above. I mean, these are broad indicators, but it gives you some idea of what the various modes can do. MSK144 is not that sensitive. That might surprise you, but actually the point about meteor scatter is not pulling out weak signals. The signals can be quite strong. It's actually integrating this lots of short reflections into a meaningful signal, a meaningful QSO. So that's a different challenge to pulling out weak signals from the noise. CW maybe down to minus 15, depends how good your ears are, depends what filters you like to use. FT4 down to about 17.5 and FT8 to minus 21. JT65 to minus 25, so you can see how sensitive that is. Here's a screenshot recently from FT8 from in my shack when the band was open. The red is signals calling me or working me, and you see it in the spectrum, the waterfall display at the top, signals within a 3 kilohertz bandwidth. So you know, within an SSB filter bandwidth on your rig, and you normally position yourself in one fixed spot. Rather than chasing around, you find a clear spot, you stay there and call others and work them. You don't necessarily call on their frequency because if everybody did that, they would all blot each other out. Whereas if they stay on their own frequency, then the guy at the other end, the DX station, hopefully, can pick you off one at a time and work you. I've included the photo there just because I was very pleased to have my photograph taken with Joe at Visalia several years ago. Joe, of course, is a Nobel Prize winner. He got his Nobel Prize for picking up very weak signals, pulsars, from the other end of space. And it's basically as a result of being able to pull very weak signals out of space that he's taken that expertise into pulling very weak signals out of 6 meters and the other amateur bands. One of the things we chase on 6, of course, is squares. People get very excited about this. I can't say I do, but there was a time when, as there weren't that many countries to work on the band, the joy was in working squares, and there are lots of awards for square chasing on 6 meters. But you know, here's my DX Century Club Award. It dates back to 2002 when I was able to apply for 100 countries worked and confirmed on 6 meters. It's hard to believe now, but when the ARRL were first asked if they would have a Century Club Award for 6 meters, they said there's absolutely no point because nobody is ever going to work 100 countries on 6 meters. And of course, you know, as I said, even since early May, I've worked 80 countries and I fully expect to work well over 100 this season. So what does the future bring? Well, as I said, EME is being used on more and more expeditions. We're going to see the regular use of FT8 for expeditions if we ever have any expeditions. Not be many because of COVID, of course. The big question, I think, is going to be, are we going to see any F2 propagation during the coming sunspot cycle. Increasing use of SDR radios, I mentioned earlier, for monitoring and so on. And I guess, you know, once you've got SDR radios and so on, then remote control of radios is also feasible. So, you know, even if you're in a hotel room on business at the other side of the world, you can probably still make your station make QSOs on WSJT. You can still keep on top of what's happening on the band. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. That's up to you as an individual operator to make up your own mind. And that pretty much covers what I want to talk about. Let me open it up. Well, we'll go back to Tristan and see whether he's had any questions come in.
Yeah, thanks so much, Don. There's been a few comments on YouTube, and I'll read them out. So Steve, M0MOI says, obvious one, why magic?
Well, just because you never know what to expect next. You can have the band completely flat one day and yet absolutely heaving with signals from all over the next day. And that's why we call it a magic band, because you just never know. 20 meters you can go on and you know pretty much what to expect. On 6 meters you don't, and that's the fun of it.
So Dimitri's 5 Bravo 4 Alpha Lima Sierra says, what is the way of operating on 6 meter phone? Do you call on a specific calling frequency and QSY, or do you just stick there?
110, 50.110 is designated as an international calling frequency. And if the band is marginally open, that's the frequency people will listen on. But you shouldn't kind of hog that frequency. The idea is that once you get a pilot running or whatever, if you're a DX station, you move elsewhere in the band. And of course, when the band is wide open, then there'll be lots of activity all across the sideband section. So you don't need to focus on a particular frequency. But in terms of monitoring, when the band is flat, you monitor 110 and listen out.
So from John, Alpha Charlie 9 Uniform Victor, hello from Oak Park, Illinois, home of Hemingway and Frank Lloyd Wright. So that's from John. So that's a greeting to you, Dom.
Incidentally, I should say that one of the problems they have in the Midwest, and you just reminded me, I mean, particularly in parts of W7 and so on, is that they really don't see any sporadic E, other than very, very rarely. I don't know whether it's something to do with the terrain or whatever. The same is true in South Africa, actually. So that's why W7GJ focuses on moonbouts. Of course, the one advantage they have in those parts of the world is they tend to have a lot of space.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I've had a direct message from Bill Heather. Thank you, Bill Heather. I'm not sure if it's Heather Bill or Bill Heather. KB6WKT. What is your favorite mode on 6 meters?
Oh, my favorite mode on any band is CW. There's no question about it. But, but you know, you have to go where the action is at times. You know, I have over 160 countries on 6 meters, and most of them are being worked on CW.
This leads on to Octavia's question, M0TTV. Is the band suitable for portable QRP CW?
Absolutely, yes.
There we go. Easy answer there for you, Octavia.
Yeah, there's been a lot of CW activity today because there was very good sporadic E. The signals on FT8 were ludicrously loud. And that's an indication that the traditional modes will also be pretty loud. And yeah, there's been lots of CW activity. If you're out on a hilltop, boy, are you going to have fun, even with low power.
John Harris is saying, what chance have we got with a dipole at 5 meters in the air?
You've got lots of chance, yeah, because a dipole you don't have to rotate, so you probably hear something that somebody with the Yagi will miss because they're pointing the wrong way, and because the loud sporadic E from around Europe comes in at a high angle, a Yagi probably is not going to be that effective.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, I've actually got a dipole that's actually stuck to the ceiling. I can't move my webcam. Actually, tell you what, I bet you I can. I wonder if I can. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you were talking about dipole, and one of the people on the tonight who's on was asking about a dipole. If the conditions are good, I had a dipole, just a plain dipole for 6 meters in the loft, and I was able to work with 100 watts into the States and Canada on 6 meter CW.
Yeah.
And that was just a dipole in the loft. So it's if you're there on the day.
If you're there, yeah, again, that's the magic of it. If you're there at the right time, it's amazing what you can do. I sort of just very quickly, somebody asked about the frequency for FT4. I noticed that's on 318. So 313 for FT8 and 318 for FT4.
I had an experience last year during the Sporadic E opening. I still don't know how it happened. From a FT818, 6 watts, with its own internal whip about 18 inches high, I worked to Charlie Tango 2 from inside my shack at ground level.
Yep.
How did that work? I still don't know what propagation was.
It'll be Sporadic E. Yeah.
Yeah, that was vertical. So does it have to be vertical or horizontal? Obviously not.
Well, ideally horizontal, but vertical's not going to be that much different. I mean, by the time it's been through the E layer and been messed about, who knows what polarization it's ending up with when it reaches you.
Thanks, Tom.
We have a thing in the chat, Don, from Hotel Charlie 1 Bravo India. Benny says, saludos desde Ecuador. So there we go.
Very good.
Hello from Ecuador, I think that means.
Yes. Believe it or not, the only new country I've worked so far this year, the only all-time new one was Ecuador.
Oh, fantastic. Well,
nice opening. And here's an example. I saw the other evening, I had some propagation to the Caribbean, and I saw other UK stations working at HC, a couple of Ecuadorian stations on, and I couldn't copy a thing, and I was so frustrated. And then all of a sudden, the propagation landed on me, and I worked 2 of them in the space of 3 minutes.
Wow.
And that's what happens.
Fantastic. Mike Alisette, Golf Uniform 4 EON, says, does antenna polarization make any difference during Sporadic E? Good question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it does really. As I said, the signals can come in all sorts of propagation angles, but you're not going to put up a cross Yagi, I guess. So you do what you can. The normal thing with the Yagi is it's horizontally polarized, of course, because then you don't get any interaction with the support. But it's quite nice to have a vertical for 6 meters also for monitoring, because then you can monitor in all directions at once and know which way to point your beam.
Dave, have you got any comments from the Warrington Club?
Really interesting talk, Don. One question that did come to mind, given how you were enthusing about a dipole, why have you got a beam?
Well, as I said, you can work all around Europe with a dipole, but frankly, if you want to work the long haul stuff, a beam is going to make a difference. Incidentally, W3LPL, who's got a modest station in the States, reckons that a beam can be too high on 6 meters. He reckons about 50 feet is the perfect height for it. So you don't need to have something at 100 feet or whatever. In fact, as I said, mine at 20, 25 feet at the moment seems to be doing the biz. But yes, a beam does help for the weak signal stuff.
So what's the ideal takeoff angle?
You tell me. It depends how far you want to work, I guess. But you want a low takeoff angle, as with any as with any band, any mode, to get the longest haul, because you want to just graze the E layer rather than going straight up and back down again. If you want to work a long way.
Or a Slim Jim would be ideal.
Yes. Kristen, can I just comment? I noticed a question, does it disappoint me that all the action is on the FT8 modes at the moment? And in a sense it does, but what I would say is that they have opened up knowledge of propagation paths that we just were unaware of with the traditional modes. So I think it's a shame that so much activity has gone there, but I do find it fascinating that we're learning a lot more about propagation.
John AC9UV, I have a 6 meter squalo, seems to work well. Paul Golf 8 AQA says 22 countries in Europe worked here today. G4WQE, does 4 meter offer any similar conditions to 6 meters?
Yes, it does. Yes, absolutely. And the Sporadic E has been extending up to 4 meters quite regularly in recent days, and people have been working all over. You won't see F2 propagation on 4 meters, but you'll see most of the other forms of propagation that I've talked about. And that's why my book, which started as a 6 meter only book about 10 years ago, has been extended to cover 4 meters. And the main limitation on 4 meters used to be that there were very few countries on, but now there are lots of countries on, including, and I know they've been worked recently, Kazakhstan, Bahrain, all around the Middle East. So yes, 4 meters, definitely a lot of fun, but doesn't count towards DXCC, of course.
So your book, Don, what's the title of it again, and where can they buy it from?
Oh, you can buy it from the RSGB, from the PW bookshop, I'm sure from elsewhere, probably from the ARRL. You certainly could have the original version. And it's called The Magic Band, Guide to the Magic Bands. Yeah,
and also Don is the editor of Practical Wireless, and here's his little face here smiling at us every month. There we go. So a very, very good magazine, and highly well respected and well worth the money. And you save money if you subscribe rather than buying it from the news agents. Tango India 2 Charlie Delta Alpha says, is there a more established plan for the EU wall QRM between EUS on FT8, and what's also the protocol regarding decimal 323? Thanks. Do you understand that?
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. So the normal thing is that European stations transmit in first time slot, because the FT8 uses 15-second time slots. So Europeans transmit on the minute and on the half minute, and the DX, whether it's Japan or the States, transmits on the quarter minute or the 3/4 minute. And that way you don't mutually interfere. But 323 is by common consent used only for intercontinental QSOs. And I worked an A62 on there earlier today. So there is activity on there. And the other day when the band was open to the States, there was a lot of activity on 323.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us from all over the world. Thank you for the Berry Radio Society members for being here. Wonderful to see you. And for the Warrington Amateur Radio Club. Yeah, so thank you, everybody, for joining. So thank you ever so much, Don, for a wonderful talk. On behalf of Berry Radio Society, and I'm sure Warrington Amateur Radio Club and the rest of the world, I just thank you, and give it up for Don.
Hey. Here.
Well done.
Yeah.
Thank you, Don, and thank you so much for giving up your time as well. It's so valuable and very much appreciated.
Not at all, although I'm looking forward to being able to give real talks rather than Zoom talks again.
Right, thank you, Don. You're a star, absolutely brilliant.